Joining us once again is Dave Zirin, edgeofsports.com, also sports editor at The Nation. Dave, a couple of things to talk about today. Number one, you wrote this article, Did Shaquille O'Neal Just Box Out Mumia? And in the article, you outline how Newark's only kind of big movie theater, which is co-owned by Shaquille O'Neal, pulled a scheduled showing of a documentary about Mumia Abu-Jamal, who much of our audience is probably familiar with. If not, he spent the last 3 decades not only in prison, but arguing what he says is a lack of a good case and a proper prosecution against him in the alleged shooting of police officer Daniel Faulkner. Now, what do you know about the connection between Shaquille O'Neal, the ownership of the theater, and the decision to pull that showing of the movie?
Well, first of all, let me be clear. I spent several weeks attempting to get comment from Shaquille O'Neal. I worked every contact. I even had some direct contact information for Shaq himself. Was not able to get so much as a statement. But there was enough that I knew and my editors knew circumstantially that made this a story that we felt like we needed to publish. Because this is a free speech story. This is not a story about Mumia, his guilt or innocence. It's a story about whether or not the city of Newark would have access to a documentary that had been scheduled and that was ready for a serious audience in Newark. Now, here's what we know for sure. Shaquille O'Neal co-owns the theater. Shaquille O'Neal also is someone who's a volunteer sworn-in sheriff in multiple cities, in Miami, in Los Angeles, and he used to do ride-alongs in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where he went to college at LSU. We also know that Shaquille O'Neal was cited for police brutality on one of those ride-alongs in Baton Rouge for sticking somebody's head in a toilet and flushing it repeatedly. Now, what else do we know? We know that Shaquille O'Neal is from Newark. He's from several places because his father was an Army guy. They traveled around a great deal, but he spent a lot of his formative years in Newark. And we also know that Shaquille O'Neal's chief of security / manager is a longtime former Newark police officer. And so we know that the movie was scheduled. We know that there was a meeting that involved Shaquille O'Neal and the theater management. And then we know that the film was killed. The film was going to show in Newark, and then it wasn't. And this raises a lot of questions, not the least of which is, should the people of Newark be denied any film because an owner of a, let's forget about Shaquille O'Neal for a second, just because the owner of a theater finds something objectionable, should he be then allowed to pull something that had already been scheduled? So to me, there are some very troubling issues here that even go well beyond the actuality of Mumia's case and Shaquille O'Neal as a famous celebrity.
Yeah, I mean, I think the details of Mumia's case are almost secondary, right? Because as we know, even if you believe a lot of the circumstances of the prosecution were not in order, that's a very separate issue from whether you believe or don't believe that he did the act of which he is accused, and that's kind of a whole separate issue. So really the issue is, I guess, Dave, or maybe you don't think I'm right about that.
No, I do, but the only thing I would add is there's also a separation between a film that deals with those issues and this particular film. This particular film, Long Distance Revolutionary, is not about the case, but it's very specifically about the kind of journalism that Mumia has been able to do behind bars for the last 30 years, which to me makes it even an extra layer of egregiousness that it would be pulled. And I should say, in the interest of full disclosure, that I'm one of the talking heads in the movie because of some interaction I've had with Mumia about the intersection of sports and politics.
So bottom line, let's assume that because of Shaquille O'Neal's, we don't know this, but because of Shaquille's personal feelings about the showing of this film, he killed the screening of it. Ultimately, even if you personally believe that the interests of Newark residents are not being served by this movie not being shown, what really is the allegation, given that it's a private movie theater and management ultimately can make whatever call they want, right?
Yeah, I mean, the number one allegation would be that they never should have scheduled it in the first place then. That they're being very derelict in their basic functioning as a theater. And keep in mind, it's the only movie theater. It's the only Cineplex in all of Newark. And I think with that comes a certain public trust as well. And so if people think, wow, we're not only just going to get the latest Pixar craptastic movie, or Die Hard 12, but we're actually going to get a documentary that might feed our minds and might educate our community, and to then have that pulled. I mean, it's a bitter pill, to be sure. I mean, Newark is already a city that's been starved so much by industrial neglect, by police brutality, by flight, and on top of all of that, not be able to see a film just because Shaquille O'Neal disagrees with it is something that I think is a pretty bitter pill for people to swallow. And given that Shaquille O'Neal considers himself a son of Newark, that's a quote that he is how he has described himself. It would be nice if he would just make some sort of public statement as to whether or not he had this film pulled.
We're going to be watching for that statement.